Yeah, so thank you, Phil. Thank you for coming to Science Sunday. We do this the second Sunday of the month. And Bob, I'm not on. Thank you. It's working, but not right. It's working, but not right. Okay, there we go. I'll repeat. Thank you for coming. Second Sunday of the month, we have Science Sunday. And Bob Anthony's done one before, last May it was, I think. I can't remember the title, but you remember the title. Anyway, he's come back to talk about principles, faith, and humanity. And you accept people asking questions throughout, right? You accept that people ask questions during. But if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Wait for the mic, not me, this one, because it's being recorded and it'll be on YouTube later. So otherwise, you'll repeat the question. You need it.
I need this mic, so if you could, Mike, Amy's giving you another microphone to carry around if people ask. Appreciate that. Thanks a lot. Oh, welcome. I need to get on with it here so we can have some fun. How I'm approaching this, and I need to read this to get it off to a start so it doesn't balloon too far. And that is, after a brief reminder of the successes and pride society gained from discovering scientific principles, I'll address some of their inherent limitations, the limitations of science in itself. My intent is to help you to understand where these limitations arise so you can be aware of them in your thinking, and if you're intrigued, you can then go to the internet to find out a lot more. But these limitations open the doors for a lot of things that some people might exclude in their thinking if they weren't aware of them. So I just wanted to say that there are lessons of faith and humility buried within these limitations. So let me get on with it. First off, I think I was born curious, and I kept wondering how things worked and probably pestered my father a lot with questions about, you know, how does this work, explain this, and so forth and so on. And one day he came to me, and he was sort of a great joker. He liked to tease me. So he asked, "Do you have a minute?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me all you know." And I thought about it a minute, and I thought, well, what might I know? And then I thought, well, I think I know that. But then he's going to come back and say, "How do you know that?" And pretty soon I knew I was going to be in big trouble. So as I recollect, I remained silent and walked away. And that's kind of the prelude for all of what's coming here. The second thing is, when I went to the University of Michigan, I started out in engineering, sort of following in Dad's footsteps, and then realized all of these fields seemed to lead to a rather narrow specialization. And I was trying to get out from under that. So I went into physics because it looked like it was a license to learn about just about everything, and especially high energy physics because it was studying the most elementary particles. The scheme of science up until that time had been a reductionist scheme to find out fundamentally what's going on in the world. And the physicists of the world have reduced our understanding to a handful of equations and 23 different parameters, and it's an amazing accomplishment. So this program that was set in motion about 400 years ago has really been quite successful. And in meantime, this was the 60s, so there was a lot of civil rights and social action on campus. And I got involved with the campus ministry where all of this stuff was organized, and we had noon discussions every Tuesdays and Thursdays from faculty. And we weren't taking their courses, so we were brutal. I mean, we grilled the professors and the politicians and everybody else that came in, including Malcolm X. And then when I graduated with a degree in physics, I had the feeling that every decision that affected my life was made in Washington, and it was made, from various policies, and I wanted to be rather part of that rather than just at the whip end of it. And so I tried to find a niche, and that was technology assessment, which is looking at the relationship between society and technology, specifically the unintended consequences of technology and how our society shapes technology. So every science was free game from human geography to psychology to economics to you name it. So it was a playground while it lasted. About 2 decades ago, there was an organization called the Washington Evolutionary Systems Society, which had monthly dinner meetings and speakers, and they were looking at anything that would evolve. And this includes, we had historians, lawyers, philosophers, mathematicians, biologists, ecologists, you name it. There wasn't anything that it didn't apply to. And the reason I got interested in it was, as a part of technology assessment, the only thing that holds still over a long period of time are the principles behind how society works and how the technology works. And so you needed to drill down to the principles in order to be able to get a handle on even asking the right questions or seeing the possibilities. And pretty soon you know that what you're doing is not forecasting in the sense of predicting. What you're doing is saying, here are the possibilities and how are we going to cope with them if they happen. And that's what nature has been doing for years and years and years on its own, and led to a very organized structure of ecologies and our own organism and everything else. And the principles embedded in those fields are really valuable to transfer to society and everywhere else. Anyhow, that's more or less where I'm coming from. So I'm asking now, why might these principles be valuable to all of you? First off, they really help you to remember important lessons. And I do recollect an engineering professor saying, 20 years from now, you'll never remember much of anything out of this course. There are just a couple things that'll stick with you. So I took that to heart, and for every course, I'd ask myself, what is it that's going to stick with me? Because the rest of this, I'm going to have to look up again. That's another reason it came down to principles. The next thing is it helps to organize a task. If you can get down to the fundamentals, you have some prospect of getting your arms around the whole problem. You're not going to have a lot of loose ends because the principles tell you what matters and what doesn't matter. And then the next thing is you can also have a pretty good bullshit meter when something violates a fundamental principle. Now, that doesn't mean you can't learn. The person may know more than you do, but at least you know the question to ask and how to kick the tires. And finally, I think that most people look to science to look for the grounding of truth these days. And what they're really looking for are those principles and the things that are well established in science. So that's my introduction to science, and let's pop to the next one. Now, this is kind of an ode to science. In a sense, it's the blessing and the curse. Right now, human beings are the greatest geological force on Earth in terms of moving Earth and carbonic acid from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increasing the rate of erosion. We're moving more dirt than nature. And then the second thing is that if you look at human beings and their domesticated animals, you add up all the biomass, it's 90% of all the mammalian biomass on Earth. So the other 10%, many of them are either endangered or like tigers and so on, they persist because we want to have them as sort of zoo animals. And so it's really a testimony to how dominant the human being has become on the Earth. And then I do need to say a couple things about what scientists actually do, and Mike can chime in if I get it wrong. But first of all, they're curious and they observe behavior, and they try to see things and look for things that might be missed otherwise. And then and especially things that fall outside of what we think we already know. But then when they see it, they hypothesize some kind of material explanation of what produces this material effect. So you're looking for cause and effect in a material world. And then there's the use of reason, which then is formalized into formal logic, which is formalized even more into math. But the point is that you're looking for an explanation in causal sense based on logic. And then last of all, it is a cultural activity. So you get the temerity to stand up and defend it among your peers. And if they kick the tires and can't see a reason that it leaks, well, for the moment at least, it holds. And then sometime later, who knows? But anyhow, it is a cultural activity. Now, I want to jump right into this. And what I'm doing is thinking that the classical physicists had done an excellent job of describing Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian interpretation of electromagnetism and light and so forth. So they thought they were on top of the world. They'd pretty much explained everything except for a few little loose ends. One of which, and this is a little out of time and sequence, but as a thought experiment, they would have known they were in trouble. This is a double slit experiment, and it's a cartoon, but what it represents is a light source that is very, very weak, that produces a set of electromagnetic waves that shine across two different slits. Some of the wave goes through one, some of the wave goes through the other. Those waves interfere, and they leave a interference pattern which represents the intensity of light that strikes that panel. In terms of quantum mechanics, what that is a probability distribution of where you'll likely see a photon expose a grain of film on the film in a scatter of dots. So if you have a very weak source, you're not getting a nice uniform exposure, you're just getting a scattering of dots. And the rub is that when quantum mechanics came along, you have two parts to the process, and I think I'll go to the next slide to explain that. And I'll skip the first point and complete this thought. The wave aspect, you calculate that exactly. It's deterministic. You don't have any choices. But when you get to the end of the calculation, what do you have? You have a probability distribution over all possibilities that nature allows. But when you do an experiment or you query, you look at the result, you actually only get one of those possibilities. So nature somehow magically pulls the rabbit out of the hat. This random event, it chooses one of those possibilities. And so all of a sudden we have an effect without a cause. Now, quantum mechanics is probably the most well-established part of physics that there is. It explains the stability of atoms. I mean, if it weren't for quantum mechanics, everything around us, including ourselves, would collapse. And it also explains the evolution of the universe from the Big Bang on. I mean, the quantum fluctuations in the early universe are what you see in the, well, 1/10,000th of the microwave background radiation coming from all directions. Those fluctuations are a result of a quantum mechanical fluctuations at the origins of the universe, and allows us to do an extremely precise calculation of how old the universe is, etc. Whole other talk for that one. So let me pop on to the next slide. Now we have an effect without a cause, and let's dig into that a little bit. First off, it's a limitation to science itself. What you have is an observed effect in the real world without the foggiest idea what causes it. That is not something scientists like. So they did all sorts of gymnastics to try to explain it. And whoops, sorry. And the first class of explanations were hidden variable theories. That is, we're missing something from our equations, and we can put in a bunch of variables that will somehow explain where that grain was exposed. Well, a long story. There's been 50 years of struggle to try to develop hidden variable theory, and it's getting more and more swept into the corners to the point that it's standing on its head, so to speak. It's really on the ropes and probably not sustainable. The other hypothesis is, well, that grain of film was exposed to you in your experience, but there's somebody else out there that saw it exposed somewhere else, and somewhere else, and somewhere else. So every observable creates a new world. In other words, multiple worlds. So that everything is the deterministic equation, and nothing is in this collapse where you see the specific result. Well, then I ask, what world am I living in? And so this I find to be less scientific than just forgetting about it. That's my view, but there are some people that subscribe to it. So if we accept quantum mechanics from the way I've described it, we bump up against some possibilities. Number one, there's the possibility of free will. In other words, somehow consciousness or will or whatever could meddle with nature in a way that we can't detect and act through those choices that are made of which possibility is exhibited, and hence that shapes the outcome now and in the future. The same thing is we might have supernatural influences, someone pulling the strings behind the scenes. We just plain don't know and don't even know how to find out and know. I'll come back to that a little bit more in the future. But the point is, and this is the first lesson of humility, which is if someone comes up to you to be an atheist, or they come up to believe in God, or they come up with whatever religious views that they may have, you really are not standing on very firm ground to be adamant about saying that they're right or wrong. In other words, this is literally up for grabs. The next point that I wanted to make is kind of a weird observation. This is all my own concoction, so I haven't found it in the literature. There might be a flaw in the thinking, but it seems pretty obvious, so let me share it with you. And that is, suppose a supernatural being shapes your life in some way. You pray, you get a response, or somehow they intervene to shape your life, and you behave in a certain way as a consequence. And that being then reacts to you, and so forth and so on. Well, what do you mean by material reality? I mean, so far, we have dark energy and dark matter. The only reason that we see them is because of their gravitational effects, and those are fields. We don't see that. So in other words, we believe in things because we believe in the interactions that they have with the material world we do see. So what's the difference between these supernatural beings? So if you just redefine the material world, the supernatural being is part of it. I mean, and therefore, everything is a unity. If it affects you, it's part of nature, and if it doesn't affect you, it's not. And that's the unity of everything. So it leaves me a little bit with my head spinning because it goes on indefinitely. So next one we have. Now I want to jump to classical physics, and what I mean by that is the world of tangible objects. Avogadro's number is 1 billion times 100,000 carbon atoms per 12 grams of carbon. So what we've been talking about are events that take place at a minuscule level. But then we want to go back into the tangible world we live in. We end up with a different picture, which is largely the classical picture. And that is, classical physics connects to the small by taking averages and things like statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, chemistry, and so forth. And then you can talk about large objects or configurations. And so you have these deterministic equations, and then within that, you have some systems that are cyclical. They go around and around and around. They sort of repeat themselves periodically for many, many different cycles. And but the thing is that because of these because of these equations happen to be nonlinear and for other reasons, they may not repeat themselves perfectly each time they go around. And so there are some unexpected results. And one of those results was known well before quantum mechanics came along. It was the three-body problem, which is if you have a sun and two planets, how can you prove that that system is stable? In other words, the equations were just nasty. You couldn't solve them explicitly, and you couldn't really show that eventually somehow one of those planets wasn't going to be ejected from the solar system. And so what happened was Poincaré around 1887 showed that no matter how precisely you measured or specified the initial condition versus your measurement, no matter how small that deviation was, that deviation would amplify itself eventually to dominate the global behavior of the system in the future. And therefore, you can't prove it to be stable. And in fact, our solar system, for reasons a little different than just that dynamic, has already ejected one planet. That's why we have the properties we do here. And there were calculations done by astronomers to try to see what the likelihood is the Earth being ejected from the solar system, and it's a non-vanishing number. But it isn't going to happen overnight. It has to do with, getting out of sync with things. And then the name for that is a phenomenon that you cannot predict because it is so sensitive to the initial conditions that you can't specify it. And so they gin up a term called emergence that says, well, it might just happen, and that's about it. It's a possibility, can't say if it will or won't, but that's emergence. The next possibility is chaos. And these nonlinear equations, especially fluid dynamics, have the nasty property, same one. If you don't measure it just precisely, these cycles are likely to amplify all the measurement errors to the point that within 2 to 3 weeks, your weather forecast is converged to climatology. I mean, you have no idea whether it's going to rain or shine the next day. And we're all familiar with that. But because the chaos wipes out the possibility of weather prediction over a time frame of a month, doesn't mean we can't do climatology, which is based on constraints on those patterns. And so if you don't care which day exactly it happens, but rather just what the general dynamic is, you can do science even 1,000 or 1,000,000 years from now in a forecast or retrospective. Okay, so the point here is that science is blinded by this effect of minuscule effects. In other words, the sciences we care about, things like the weather and social dynamics and military conflict or whatever, have these chaotic properties to them. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that we just literally are, as far as we know, are beyond our ability to predict. So it's a level of uncertainty. We don't know if it's deterministic or not, but it's certainly unpredictable. Now let's up the ante to living things. And one of the key properties of, let me go through, let me back up. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'd like to give you a shorthand for Darwin's theory of evolution. And the first two steps I think everyone knows already very well. The third one may be not so familiar. The first one is that reproduction exceeds all capacity to support a particular species, so there ends up a competitive struggle for life. The second principle is that there's a diversity of characteristics among the members of any species, and on average, not deterministic, but on average, those that are more fit for the environment end up reproducing more for the next generation. That we're familiar with. The rub is, if you think of a certain amount of diversity to begin with, and you keep pushing this thing in one direction, that diversity narrows and narrows and narrows. Pretty soon you don't have any diversity left. And Darwin knew this, and he put in a third statement, basically, which is that there's an independent mechanism that creates diversity and therefore restores the level of diversity that you had to begin with. He didn't know what that mechanism was, and it wasn't until we came up with genetics and DNA and all of that that we really understood the process, but we knew it was there. And that's a key point here, and that is, oh, by the way, these evolutionary principles also apply to human cultures and to neural networks like AI. In a neural network, you're born with probably more neurons than you'll ever have in your life. Some of them get used, some of them don't get used. In age 5 or 6, something like that, there's a pruning event where the ones that aren't used are gone. They're just overhead cost to the body and they can no longer afford them. And after that, every 9 years roughly, the body goes through another purge, and in between it restores some neurons, but not all. And so you use it or lose it, literally, I mean physically. And again, that is a sort of a Darwinian process. You can look at the same principles applying at that level. So now we have two new distinct sources of uncertainty. One is, I say history matters. In other words, to know what's happening in the biological world, you have to know what happened to it in the past. In other words, the inheritance you get in DNA today was determined by what happened to your ancestors before. The same is true in ecology and society and you name it. These are systems that depend on their history. And just to underscore that, if you were to take a DNA molecule about as long as one of our chromosomes, and you were to build, if you could, build one replica of every possible string that you could make of that DNA, and you had them physically, they would fill the visible universe. In other words, there are so many possibilities, it is just staggering. So when you think of the evolutionary process, think of this wandering through this huge landscape of possibilities, and we ended up where we are, just not quite by chance, but you know, very much alone in that landscape. There aren't neighbors in the sense of it is what we have. Now, of course, at the quantum mechanical level, you can have a mutation, and that mutation could kick evolution off in a different direction. So in some sense, that meddling uncertainty that we were talking about, even though it's a billion, 100,000 times smaller than the being, the living being, it might actually kick evolution in a particular direction. And so the whole process of evolution may be guided by these chance effects. And going back to Darwin's original laws, he's talking about, on average, natural selection is on average the survival of the fittest. It's not an absolute deterministic statement of who survives and who doesn't. But again, that process is a little bit too delayed to affect free will, so it's just an interesting gap, I guess you'd say, in scientific knowledge. Now, there's another lesson here, which is called the edge of chaos. And that is that because you have a struggle for survival, it really advantages the expansion of diverse options. In other words, more strategies you have in your hip pocket to cope with things that might come up, the better off you are. Except there's an overhead, a cost to having all of those things implemented in your body. And also the complexity of the whole thing leads to a chaos in terms of all the other species and all the other neighboring members of your own species figuring out what's going to happen next. And so that chaos eventually becomes a drag on fitness. And so there's a balance between increasing the complexity so that a system that's evolving is not so rigid that it just reproduces exactly its own kind on the one hand. On the other hand, it's not so diverse and dynamic that it leads to chaos and none of the players can figure out what's going to happen next. And that has a term, edge of chaos. There are some mathematical results under that name you can look up on the web. But again, it's as much a mechanism for thinking about reality as it is a closed body of knowledge in the scientific community. It's a bit of both. Now we have one more snag. Science is based on logic. And around the turn of the century, Hilbert had a program that he proposed to the mathematical community to ground all of the known mathematics onto an axiom set that could be proven to be self-consistent and relatively complete relative to all the findings that mathematics had achieved at that point. Well, people banged their heads against that problem for quite a while, but Kurt Gödel in 1931 came up with a twist that was unwelcome. That was that he proved that any logical system cannot prove the consistency of its own results, of its own axioms. What it really meant was if the system were complete, that is, it could resolve the truth or falsehood of any statement that it could formulate, he could prove that you'd have a contradiction. So it was like, oops, you have to have an incomplete system, or if you have a complete system, you know that you're going to face contradictions. Now, this is me commenting on that result. The first thing is you don't dare have a contradictory system because you can prove that pigs fly without too much trouble, but I won't, I'm not going to trouble you with that argument. It's very simple, but it really is nasty. And so you have to avoid contradiction. So physics and the axioms it depends upon have to be incomplete. So that means you can formulate a question, a theoretical question, based on the mathematics in any subject that applies mathematics that cannot be answered by that system. It's up for grabs. It could be true, it could be false. You've got to go outside the system to resolve it. Now that leads to two other little nasty things. One is you go back to nature, yes, and nature tells you whether it's true or false. But if you're working in psychology and you find out that you have to choose the hypothesis is true, and you're working in particle physics and you have to assume that it's false in order to make progress, both of those can coexist, but they're not a consistent set of mathematics. So it's not a foregone conclusion that there's only one reality in terms of the mathematics that we're using to describe reality. So far, no one has come up against this snag, but it's not beyond comprehension. Now, the other side of the coin, where you have axioms that are let me read my slide. think I reversed it. If you have axioms that are, what I meant to say, if you have the axioms that can cover any situation that arises, which is the other, which is you have a complete coverage by the axioms, you therefore have to have contradictions. And if you think of what a system of ethical principles is telling you, or a system of law, is whatever the real world throws you, you have to make a judgment, according to the legal system. Or an ethical system has to deal with whatever comes up. Well, guess what? Those ethical principles and legal principles and laws have to be internally contradictory. What do? You have to fall back onto some kind of external judgment or external process that's outside the logical system, legal system or ethical system to resolve it. So there are ethical dilemmas all over the place. And then you can go down the wormhole and try to sort it out. Well, I just gave you the next slide. Let me read it, make sure I didn't miss something. I had a little footnote, which is pushing my luck further. This is my thinking, not, I don't find it in the literature. And that is, religions, by definition, also have to deal with where people are at and what they're all about. So their system of beliefs and principles have to be contradictory. So again, you have to have some mechanism to resolve these contradictions. Now, in a liberal religion like Unitarianism, we all have our point of view, and we can argue until the cows go home, as they say, and we may or may not be able to come to a resolution, but if we're going to get forward, we have to sort of let it go and press on and sort of adopt some path forward. In an absolutist religion, a fundamentalist religion, people have the impression that the authorities can tell them what to do in any situation, except, oops, the authorities can tell them one thing 1 minute and one thing the next minute because it's a contradictory system. And so you either end up in going down rabbit holes and not knowing it, deluding yourself, or you have some sort of arbitrary interpreter that interprets the truth for you, who might as well be a dictator because they just make up the rules as they go. So I don't think I want that system. Okay, now I'm down to faith and humility and just about ready to open it up for you guys to jump in. The first is, don't dismiss the possibilities of free will and supernatural influences, which is a sort of a lesson in humility. Now, the whole thing may be random. We just plain don't know. The point of this is we don't know, but that doesn't mean that we have the confidence and certainty to tell somebody else that they don't know. And that's sort of our first lessons in humility. And the next one is, there's an impenetrable veil of uncertainty, and that veil has layers and layers. It starts out with the quantum mechanic randomness, chaos in cycles, the unpredictability of emergence, the edge of chaos, the flaws in logic. It goes on and on. We are on thin ice. And whenever we think that we're behaving rationally, we're essentially giving up and saying, we don't have the time and energy to dig any deeper. We really just can't know this thing. We have to get on with it. And we do it by faith. But what I'm trying to say is, if you agonize as much as you want to agonize to get a logical answer in many things, it may not be there. Now, I wanted to share one more thing, which is a little bit off target, but I think it may be interesting. I can't help myself from this. And that is, how did humanity get in this mess in the first place? And I think this may reshape the way we think about, whoops, come on guys, did I turn it off? I know, I can't go back, okay, sorry. I'll put the thing down and not be so nervous here. The very last slide. I can always find the rabbit holes. I'm good at that. There are two perspectives, the individual perspective and the communal perspective. From an individual perspective, you're always faced with competitive pressure. You certainly do not want to lose a war. I'll tell you about that if you study enough about wars. And the second thing is, if you're a businessman, you might not want to go out of business. You don't know, where your retirement fund's coming from and everything else. So those are very, very intense forces of self-preservation. And what happens is, in this context of uncertainty and not knowing, there's a tendency, I think, for people to just say, I have to make these decisions and press on even though I don't know, and then try the heck to justify what they did and maybe put the horse blinders on and say, I'm not going to look at these problems, it's somebody else's problem, or whatever. Or science will save us, I don't know. You pick the excuse, but the thing is, it's the way we just charge into the future blind, and eventually we're going to stumble over something and have a catastrophe. Now, if you look at the communal perspective, what this is saying is that the stakeholders start to realize, oops, this is not good. I mean, for one thing, oligarchies and tend to the oligarchs get together and they choose not to compete with one another. We'll divide it up so the intensity of competition is not so severe. They get this point. They know that there's a lot of heat. So they come up with all sorts of ways of locking in the safety of their position. But I think we need this on a broad societal level and not just for the privileged few. And that is that we need a mechanism that is sufficiently persuasive that we agree to ease the level of competition and adopt a couple other guidelines. One is, we like competition because it innovates, but we can't just let it run free because eventually it has global impacts on our societies and even the world, like the tech industries, for example, and social media. So is to have thresholds so that you can compete all you want up to a certain scale with respect to impact on society. And then beyond that scale, you're forbidden to go any further without sort of a review of what's happening. And the companion to that, in enforcing that scale, is that you want to promote a diversity of trials so that in these small scale efforts, you can explore to find out if there are any unforeseen emergent phenomena or hiccups or things you really don't want to have happen, and what things you do want to have happen. And then there's part of that agreement is we all benefit from those lessons. So even the losers get to go back in the game and play with a much wiser understanding of what the processes are. And then you allow the scale to increase a bit more, but you also see that there is a stake for everyone in the society in these technologies that essentially are infrastructure technologies, and that you end up having to accept some degree of regulation and feedback from those that are affected by it. Now, that's the ideal world that I'm painting, and I don't see an alternative to that, but I think we're stuck in the first one right now, and I don't know how much pain we're going to have to suffer to get out of it. Anyhow, that's my perception of reality at the moment. Now, any questions?
Thank you, Bob. Very interesting. I agree with nearly everything you said. What I understood, I agree with. Any questions? Julie.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the principles that you discussed and how they relate to where we stand right now with globalization. Do you see that the principles in physics in terms of diversity and so on, have gotten us to the point where we are now with globalization, where we're kind of like at a tipping point that this has caused,
Yeah.
is causing us
Yeah.
conflict,
Yeah,
let's say?
This is almost restating the obvious. For most of human evolution and most of our history, human beings were relatively small players on the planet, and therefore nature would solve and restore itself given our bad behavior and whatever. And therefore, if we treat nature as a trash bin and just throw our waste in it, or are negligent about what's happening, it didn't matter much. But the fact is that we have gone to such a scale right now that we're really threatening the entire Earth and its well-being. So the principles of physics and the principles of chemistry and the basic hard sciences have given us this leverage to apply technology and to do things like mining, which really scars the Earth and creates a lot of special interests that operate abroad where we don't see the impacts. It's part of the problem. But the real problem, I think, is the ecological side of it. And I mean, in principle, the ecological, which is the human behavioral side. I saw somewhere recently a statement that there's like a factor of 10 between the wealth of the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries. And the underdeveloped countries are the ones that produce the goods and do a lot of the scut tasks that we don't want to absorb here. So even if we consider fairness, if we're thinking of fairness to the immigrants that are taking the tasks most people don't want to do, think about the people that are abroad. They're even in worse shape. And this is kind of a form of neo-colonialism. And so there's a huge resentment. And that whether these folk ever get the political power is one question, but the other question that I keep nagging with is as we penetrate ecologies we haven't penetrated before, and as we create these nasty conditions abroad, it's a hotbed for disease. And we're going to get hit with something we just can't handle. So, I mean, we're going to get our comeuppance one way or the other. And therefore, I just think people need to have a perspective that understands the scope of what's happening on the scale that it's happening, so they can understand, even if they're an oligarch, that they may not be safe, and they've got to get on board.
Other questions? Comments?
Bob, I'm really struck by your talk. Something that's always been of interest to me is what are the limits of what we can know? And you're dealing with much of it from coming at it from what we know now and looking back. I like to think sometimes about how we started this whole process, and I think about Plato and the fact that he postulated a world in which reality existed, but we were slaves in a cave. And in this cave, there's a fire going on way back behind us. Reality's between us, our backs, because we're facing the wall of the cave, and we're looking at only reflections of reality that we can see, these images that we see as shadows on the wall of the cave. And it's a pretty useful image to me to think about trying to probe reality this way, because we have limits to what we can know and understand.
Yes.
And I remember having these discussions in college about the difference between science and religion. And it seemed to me a very powerful argument for saying, you know, there are certain things that we cannot probably know about religion or about this spiritual life or about that science is not going to be able to show us. And I like going back to the fundamental principles and those damn Greeks who were so smart. I mean, they had mathematics, they had some science, they were able to make rational arguments. And I thought, even though I don't visualize this process as being slaves in a cave, the idea of this seems to me very potent. There are things
Yeah.
we just can't know. And, you know, when you talk about chaos theory, I remember reading Gleick's book. I don't know how you pronounce his
Yeah,
name.
Glick or whatever,
But
yeah.
the guy doing weather forecasting at MIT.
Edwards, yeah.
He had a set of nonlinear equations. He put in 0.95 for his starting conditions, and he got a whole bunch of results. He walked away, and he had to restart it. And he couldn't remember what he put in, and I think he put in 0.96. And the behavior of the system was totally different with 0.96 than it was with 0.95. So that was a sort of an example of chaos theory. And the fact that how are you gonna sort that one out? You'll never figure out the initial condition to make the equations right.
Yeah, now, you brought two thoughts to mind, and I'll try to be brief. One is, I started thinking about cause and effect. And Aristotle believed that for every effect there's a cause, but he had four kinds of causes. Intent was one of them, and then there was a material cause, and yada, yada. And that was classical scholasticism until Bacon came along and said, why don't we look at the real world again and see if it really behaves that way? And then you roll it forward a little bit, and Descartes says, well, you have cause and effect enforced in the material world, and then there's the mind-body separation. You have this spiritual world and so forth, so he didn't get burned at the stake by the Catholic Church. And then we roll a little bit further past Darwin and a bunch of others, and we end up in a world now where we look to the sciences have meddled in virtually everything, and it doesn't look like they have much of a limitation to keep going in many areas. And so the truth has sort of gravitated to people trusting science for the truth. But again, this cause and effect thing is still sitting there, you know, nipping at our heels, so we've kind of forgotten it. That's one thing. The other is, I just got through buying a new Mac. I upgraded my Mac desktop, and it had a few hiccups in it. And I had to drill down into how do I reconnect with my Microsoft suite so I could complete this talk and a few other, and get the new printer going and all of that. And what I was thinking is that edge of chaos is that we depend on millions of people who are technologists and trash collectors and everything else in our life. And we are just virtually almost unaware of them. It's like Plato in the cave. You know, we see a vague shadow of the reality that's out there. But as soon as that reality starts to impinge on your life and the complexities that we're encountering, I'm eating up more and more of my time with overhead management of just keeping the tools going in my life on track. I don't know how anybody gets any work done anymore. So I feel like the edge of chaos is catching up with us here. Anyhow, thanks for the question.
Another dramatic example of how randomness can have dramatic effects. So take a neutron by itself. It's got a half-life of about 15 minutes, okay? So in any 15-minute period, it may decay or may not decay, neither violate laws of physics. You just don't know. Now, suppose you have this device. If it decays, it triggers a Geiger counter, which sets off an atom bomb. If it doesn't decay, all is peace and quiet. You know, so that's going to peace and quiet. No, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, thanks. Any other questions? Sterling, wait for the microphone.
To sort of change the orientation of where the discussion's been going, I was sort of intrigued by your coverage of supernatural, because I'm getting the impression that perhaps I shouldn't disqualify the existence of the possibility of the supernatural because I can't prove or disprove it. And that sort of leaves me with I'm standing on thin ice when I'm talking to somebody that's coming at me saying that they've experienced supernatural, and I don't feel I have all the tools to really go back at them. So I have to show more humility than what I'm used to?
Yeah, well, I agonized over this a bit because Sapolsky, who is I think he's a neurophysiologist, but anyhow, he's very, very knowledgeable scholar in how the brain works and so forth. He wrote a book called Determined, and he made this, what he thought was an ironclad argument, including the physics, that our brain is a machine, that it has so much error-correcting machinery in there and so on. It is, these effects can't possibly, influence things. And I was thinking about all this and realized that, for one thing, we live on this edge of chaos, which he didn't really take into account. There are a lot of points where you're saying, should I or shouldn't I? The temptation is great, but maybe the consequences aren't that wonderful. And we're faced with these things a lot. And a little bit of a tip, one way or the other, could make a difference. Now, one thing I didn't speculate, and this is pure speculation, is that, yes, that individual event on that one grain of film, that is dependent upon, one atom, let's say, at the atomic level. But suppose the deity operates by correlating across many, many, many of these through that unknown, meddling process. We don't know. It could be a more coherent process. And how would, if it just looks random to us, we can generate pseudo-random number generators that are completely deterministic that pass many of the tests for being random. They fail eventually, but they look pretty good. Well, nature may be even better. So I'm just saying that we really can't know. And if we want to have free will, that is, if your conversation with them makes any sense at all, because you have a will to choose and decide, and you believe in your ability to decide, maybe you should give a little slack and say there's possibility of something else out there. But and that humility, I think, opens up the ability to talk with people, to listen to them and to say, where are you at and what are the consequences of what you're believing? Anyhow.
Yeah, I comment. We physicists should be very humble because cosmologists tell us that the matter we know about, atoms, stars, gas, dust, is only about 5% of all the stuff in the universe. And about 20%, astronomers say there's matter out there that we haven't understood. We call it dark matter. We don't know what particles it's made of, if it's made of particles. And then about 70% is called energy. It's really invisible energy, and we don't know what that is. There's plenty of room in there for what one might say is supernatural today, but will become part of the natural. Supernatural, I say, is things we can't explain with known physics, but plenty of, that's another talk.
Yeah.
But
well, the other rub is a footnote. There was a cosmologist that was working at IDA. He'd finally given up on cosmology because he didn't see a path forward, and he came to work at IDA, and we'd sit over the lunch counter and we'd talk about stuff. And he eventually got around to giving a very good talk on what's known in cosmology today, including the dark energy and the Big Bang and all of that stuff. And he laid out the problems that Guth's theory of inflation and the Big Bang solved. And then as his talk went on, he spun out about 4 or 5 other questions that theory posed. In other words, the number of questions that it posed exceeded the number of questions that it answered. And I think that's sort of characteristic of science. The more we know, the more we can hypothesize, and the more we realize, we don't know that yet. So
is time for one more question, and then I've got a announcement.
Oh.
And then yes.
Yes.
Sir.
Oh, it was over here.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I wasn't
I'd
looking
like to
your
go
way.
back to one of your first slides.
Yeah.
You said that you moved from physics and Michigan to policy and Washington. Could
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit more about that decision?
Messy. In short, I managed to decide I wanted to leave high energy physics. I got a job with Bendix Aerospace that had a field office in Washington, and I was working as a science liaison with national NRL, National Naval Research Lab, and on an X-ray astronomy experiment. And that was interesting work, and it was a piece of cake because I was familiar with the technologies and did some useful stuff. But I find that I really wanted to move toward policy, so I asked him if I could take half time and then knock on doors around Washington. And I eventually knocked on a welcoming door and did a study of delivering social services and other kinds of services in rural areas using broadband. This is back in 1971. And so I reinvented the wheel, which is Zipf's law of city-size distributions, which shows that there is no functional definition of a small town, that it's a very, very smooth mathematical distribution, inverse power law, from New York City of 18 million down to a two-family farm. And the whole point of it was that the United States integrates all these communities because they have an automobile. And other societies, it has a cutoff because they can't quite get into the hinterlands. And that sort of said that transportation options look sort of like a car, but there may be other ways in which it's used. And one final footnote is in rural areas, a lot of folk would hitch a ride with a mail delivery guy, which is illegal. But it was the community, they knew one another, and it was a way of getting around. And so you bend the rules a little bit to make it work. So if the more you bring this to light, the more you might put a kibosh on it. And so anyhow, moral dilemmas. Sorry for the long story, but...
Okay, let's thank Bob again for a very interesting, thought-provoking talk. And I have one announcement and then a commercial. The announcement is next one in May, the second Sunday in May, will be Steve Conn of our church, who's going to talk about something like who's afraid of artificial intelligence. So that should be very interesting. Now the commercial is that I have a new book published and out there. It's called Space, Times Matter, 100 Short Stories About the Universe. And I just saw today it's got, if you go to Amazon, you'll see it, and you can see a review, 5 stars out of 5. Joe Fletcher. Does anybody know who Joe Fletcher is? He somebody we know here? I don't know. He said, must read for space and physics fans. Great format, break down the mysteries of the universe into 100 bite-sized stories. The book is legit as it gets for science, space enthusiasts. He says something about me, but I won't repeat that. Modesty.
By the way, I bought a copy, and it's very entertaining. He even has his own poetry in the back. So
I've got some outside if you'd like to get it. Otherwise, get it on Amazon, and I'll sign it later. Thank you, everybody.